They thought she would snap. They wanted her to yell, to rage, to feed the spectacle. But Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez didn't give them what they wanted. She gave them silence. 45 seconds of it, no blinking, no rebuttal, just her eyes, locked on Caroline Leavitt, watching as the congresswoman from New Hampshire unraveled in real time. AOC didn't lift a finger, didn't raise her voice. And yet, by the time those 45 seconds were over, the room had shifted. The air was thicker. The country was listening. Something ancient stirred, like justice without noise, like thunder without storm. Because sometimes what you don't say says everything. And just so we're clear, what you're about to witness is a dramatization. The names are real, the emotions are real, the silence was real. But this story, it's our way of holding a mirror to power, reminding America that when the microphones are hot and the world is watching, character is the loudest voice in the room. The room looked like democracy carved in stone, white walls, wood-paneled arches, and rows of flags that didn't move but still demanded attention. High ceilings gave the illusion of openness, but the tension hanging in the air was thick enough to bottle. It was just past 9 a.m. on Capitol Hill, but the Rayburn hearing room was already a pressure cooker. Cameras lined the back wall like hungry vultures, their red lights blinking in unison, each waiting to catch the next headline, the next scandal, the next viral moment. C-SPAN's crew checked tripod levels. CNN and Fox were jockeying for side angles. Even TikTok live streamers had somehow made it into the overflow gallery. The world wasn't just watching, it was leaning in. An aide in a crisp navy suit rushed past, whispering something urgent into a mic hidden beneath her lapel. Another scurried toward the dais with a stack of printed statements, trembling slightly as she nearly tripped over a wire. The wood floor creaked beneath heels and Oxfords. The murmur in the room had rhythm, low, sharp, unsettled, like a drum roll that never broke. At the center of it all stood Caroline Leavitt. She didn't sit. She posed, hair in perfect control, blazer bright red. She looked less like a congresswoman and more like someone auditioning for a cable news special called America First, The Reckoning. Her eyes scanned the room with the precision of someone who had already rehearsed their applause lines in the mirror that morning. And when she finally lowered herself into the chair behind the placard that bore her name, Leavitt RNH, she smiled just slightly. Not for the press, for the cameras, for the moment she knew she would claim as hers. She had her speech memorized. She had her lines timed. She had already picked the clip that would go viral on Twitter by lunch. But what she didn't have, what she didn't even seem to notice, was the woman 3 seats down to her left. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat like still water. No makeup crew, no statement colors. Just a soft gray suit, dark hair pulled back tightly, and a legal pad filled with notes that weren't meant for anyone's approval. She didn't check her phone. She didn't straighten her posture. She simply watched. And as Caroline Leavitt chuckled quietly with the representative from Florida beside her, AOC's gaze never left the room. Not for 1 second. She wasn't here to react. She was here to register. Across the gallery, a sound technician from the Capitol media team bent low behind a panel of switches, frowning. He tapped the button for microphone 4. Then again. The light flickered, then steadied. He muttered under his breath, almost to himself, "We're live across 5 networks. No room for mistakes today." No one heard him, or rather, everyone ignored him. But the mic didn't. A light above the panel glowed red, not flashing, just constant, just waiting. AOC finally blinked. Once, slowly, then tilted her head as if hearing something no one else could. Her fingertips grazed her legal pad. She wrote nothing. And Caroline Leavitt, still unaware, leaned toward her aide and whispered, "She'll try to play the victim again. Just wait. I've got the data and the zingers. They won't know what hit them." The aide didn't reply, but behind them, one of the C-SPAN interns raised an eyebrow and checked the mic feed again. Odd. Mic 7 was still hot. Someone in the gallery coughed. A Capitol police officer adjusted his belt and looked toward the doors. Outside, thunder rolled faintly over D.C., but inside this room, something louder was brewing. Not a storm, a shift. And somewhere deep in the subconscious of every person present, A sense of something unspoken whispered, "Whatever happens here today, it won't stay in this room." The gavel came down once, clean and sharp, and the room shifted into silence. The chairman cleared his throat and gestured toward the line of speakers. Caroline Leavitt was first. Of course she was. She had positioned herself to be first, both in seating and in sound. Without hesitation, she leaned into the mic. Her voice carried easily, trained to cut through noise shaped by years of campaign rallies and combative interviews. But here on this floor, it rang differently. Not because it was louder, but because it was looking for something. Attention, reaction, confrontation. This committee convenes today to discuss the consequences of an immigration policy that has spun wildly out of control, Leavitt began. But let's not pretend we don't know why. We are not here because the system is broken. We're here because it's being broken on purpose. A ripple moved through the room, subtle but there. Some leaned forward, some crossed their arms. Others glanced toward the third seat on the left. Leavitt didn't look at AOC directly. She didn't need to. Every word, every pause, every inflection had been rehearsed with one goal, to draw the frame around one face, Alexandria's. She continued, voice rising just enough to register beyond the chamber. There are those, many of them sitting in this very room, who've become the face of reckless open borders, who think compassion means chaos, who have turned law enforcement into villains and lawbreakers into heroes. The American people deserve to know where that path leads. There it was, not a name, but a mirror, held up with just enough angle that everyone could see who she meant. A congresswoman from New York, a daughter of the Bronx, AOC. Alexandria didn't move. She didn't blink. She simply listened. Leavitt went on, now with a cadence that played like performance. I represent a district that has watched families struggle to find work while others are handed resources for simply crossing a line. My constituents are angry, and they should be. Their voices are drowned out by slogans and selfies, by those who sit in power and act as if borders are optional, as if this nation is some vague idea instead of a sovereign home. She glanced across the dais just briefly, enough to let the message land, then turned back to her notes. I am not here to shame anyone. I am here to stand for those who no longer feel they have a seat at the table. This committee may dress up radical policies as empathy, but my job is to remind us that security is not cruelty. It is clarity. It is responsibility. Her closing line was sharper than the rest, tucked neatly into her last sentence, like the tip of a knife. Some may prefer hashtags. I prefer facts. She clicked her pen, sat back, and smiled. A few quiet claps came from her side of the aisle. Her aide nodded approvingly. The cameras had gotten everything. But across the room, Alexandria remained unchanged. She sat with her hands folded, her eyes steady, not on Leavitt, but on the crowd. The witnesses, the aides, the ones who weren't speaking, but who were listening nonetheless. She knew the game. She knew the rhythm. Stir emotion, beta reaction, own the clip. But she also knew something Leavitt hadn't noticed. The microphone that recorded her speech, the same one that broadcast her indirect attack, was still hot, still recording, and the hearing had only just begun. Alexandria allowed herself the smallest breath, a measured inhale, and then silence. America was still watching, and now it was beginning to listen. There was a pause after Leavitt finished, just long enough to let her words echo, just long enough to feel like she'd won something. On her side of the room, a few heads nodded in rhythm, the kind of quiet affirmation that doesn't come from understanding, but from agreement already decided. Her posture straightened, her hands folded like she had just placed the final word in a carefully planned sentence. She glanced briefly across the aisle, not directly at Alexandria, but near enough, close enough to say, "Your move." Alexandria didn't speak, not yet. She shifted her weight slightly, leaned forward over her notes, not with urgency, but like someone gently pulling open a drawer they already know the contents of. Her left hand grazed the wooden table, her right adjusted the edge of her legal pad. She lifted her eyes, not sharply but fully, meeting the space between them with a look that didn't need translation. Calm, certain, unbothered. There was something in that moment, a quiet, almost imperceptible tightening of the room. The temperature hadn't changed, but the stillness had. People who'd been looking at their phones raised their eyes. A journalist at the back lowered her pen, just a little slower than before. A congressional aide paused her typing. No one was sure what would happen next. That was the weight of it, this feeling that something was about to tip. And then Alexandria smiled. It wasn't wide, it wasn't smug. It was the kind of smile you give when someone thinks they've drawn blood but missed the vein entirely. The kind of smile that doesn't respond to insult with anger, but with knowing. A small, patient, deliberate lift of the corner of her mouth, like punctuation to a sentence only she had written. Across from her, Caroline Leavitt took the smile as proof of victory. She leaned into it, mistaking stillness for surrender, silence for softness. She exhaled slightly, relaxing into her chair, tapping her fingers once against the desk in the rhythm of a win. She didn't know the moment was still building, because not every explosion makes noise. Just a few feet away, the technician monitoring the soundboard shifted in his seat. He adjusted one knob, then another, but his eyes didn't leave Channel 7. It was lit solid red, not flickering, not pulsing, solid. He reached for the monitor feed, confirmed what he already suspected. That mic hadn't cut. It hadn't faded or glitched. It had stayed on, live, active, and open. He leaned toward the communications intern seated next to him and whispered under his breath, "Was this channel supposed to go down after the floor shift?" The intern blinked twice, scanned the setup, and didn't answer right away. Somewhere deep in his gut, he felt the same slow rumble that sometimes came before a hard summer rain. Back on the dais, Alexandria eased back into her seat. Still no words, still no rebuttal. Just that one precise smile lingering on her face, unmoving, uninterested in spectacle. Her eyes never left Leavitt, but they weren't angry. They were clear, alert, focused. And then she looked past her, past the cameras, past the aides, past the protocol, and somewhere into the room itself. Into the space where truth and timing sometimes meet and wait. No one said anything, not yet. But the tension, once pushed aside by Leavitt's confidence, began to creep back in. Not loud, not sharp, just present. As if the story wasn't finished, as if the silence wasn't empty but loaded. And somewhere in the room, a red recording light refused to blink off. The recess was announced with the soft thud of the chairman's gavel and a polite reminder about returning in 15 minutes. Conversations picked up almost instantly, the way they do when people believe the show has pause. Staffers stood, stretched, whispered. Reporters moved toward exits to file notes. A few Congress members shuffled papers they wouldn't read again. The room, moments ago tense and taut, now shifted into a looser rhythm. The cameras still sat in place, but the blinking lights no longer commanded attention. They looked idle, asleep. Most assumed they were cut. Most forgot that things don't really turn off in Washington. They just go quiet. Caroline Leavitt stepped back from the dais and walked toward the side hallway that connected to the members' lounge. Her heels tapped crisply against the polished wood floor, deliberate and rhythmic, like someone keeping time to their own private victory. Her staffer, a young man in a gray checkered suit, met her halfway with a phone in one hand and a rolled-up document in the other. "Well," she said, her voice light and self-assured, "that landed." The staffer grinned. "Clip's already trending in 2 states. Texas loves it. New Hampshire's eating it up too." Leavitt chuckled and shook her head slightly. "Of course they are. I mean, let's be real." She walked right into it, didn't say a word, just stared like some public school librarian waiting for the bell. The staffer laughed louder than he probably should have, but no one stopped him. To them, the cameras were dead, the press was gone, the room was theirs again. Leavitt lowered her voice, not to hide it, but to let it hang just between the two of them. That's when she said it, casual, careless, like it wasn't meant to be heavy, though it landed like lead. "That girl," she muttered, eyes glancing toward where AOC had been sitting minutes before. "She only got here because of the guilt this country still carries. She'll never understand real America." The words weren't shouted. They weren't cruel in tone, but they didn't need to be. The ugliness was in the ease, the way they slipped out, unburdened by doubt, as if she'd said it before, as if she believed it was obvious. Her staffer let out a short, breathy chuckle, the kind of laugh people give when they know it's wrong, but don't mind being complicit. He looked down, not quite meeting her eyes, but enough to let her know he heard her and that he agreed. Neither of them noticed the audio tech who hadn't yet powered down his end of the room. He wasn't even close enough to be seen, but he was still at his post. He had one headphone on, one off, just enough to catch glitches or comments. He looked at the small audio console and frowned. Channel 7 again. The light wasn't flashing this time. It was a steady glow, recording, active, live feed routed to a backup drive, just like the protocol said. He didn't say anything, not yet. In the upper gallery, a political reporter from a mid-tier outlet had just pulled out her phone to check a text from her editor. But her hand paused mid-air. She hadn't caught the whole thing, just the phrase, "Real America." Something about the way it was said. It made her thumb hover over the screen. Across the Capitol complex, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stood quietly in a hallway, sipping from a paper cup of coffee. She was alone, not isolated, just quiet, resting in the in-between, a place she'd learned to live in. She didn't know what had just been said behind her back. Not yet. But silence has a way of delivering its own truths, eventually. And microphones, as it turns out, don't believe in recess. It started with a blink, a flicker across the boom operator's monitor that shouldn't have been there, a line of waveform activity that registered when no one was supposed to be speaking into a hot mic. At first, he assumed it was leftover noise, static, maybe a late sync from Channel 7. But then he heard the voice, clean, unfiltered, no background fuzz, no crowd murmur, just a line, unmistakable in tone and intention. She only got here because of the guilt this country still carries. He froze. His headset slipped halfway off as he leaned closer to the monitor. Rewinding a few seconds, he caught the rest of it. She'll never understand real America. The silence that followed wasn't technical. It was chilling. A different kind of silence. The kind that happens when people say things they think no one will ever hear. From across the room, a production assistant glanced toward the tech board, then back at her phone. A message came in. "Are we still rolling?" She didn't answer right away. She stared at the red light on mic 7, still glowing faintly. The feed had never been cut. It had just faded into the background, while everyone assumed the world had stopped paying attention. But the world was listening. In the Capitol Media Center, 2 floors down, an intern assigned to monitor live feeds for archival purposes stood up from her desk, headphones still clutched in her hand. "We've got something," she said quietly. The supervising producer, not even looking up, replied, "Be specific." The intern hit play, the line repeated again, this time louder, this time undeniable. "Real America." No editorializing, no spin. Just a phrase soaked in assumption and exclusion. The producer leaned forward. "Get that time-coded. Now we're going to need confirmation in 30 seconds. By the time the tech team verified the source, clean audio, no splices, continuous roll, the clip had already made it to CNN's internal message board. A field producer forwarded it up the chain. Another flagged it at MSNBC. And over at Fox, a young digital editor, fresh out of Georgetown, whispered "damn" under his breath as he clipped it for the morning desk. The power of the moment wasn't in its sharpness. It was in its quiet certainty. No yelling, no dramatic gesture, just a casual confession, caught not by confrontation, but by the assumption of privacy. Exactly 2 minutes and 53 seconds after the words were spoken, the clip hit Twitter. No hashtags, no music, just 18 seconds of raw audio and video. At first, it was political Twitter. Analysts, journalists, and congressional staffers reacted with stunned emojis and clipped reposts. Then came the quotes. "She only got here because of guilt." The line was repeated and reframed. Screenshots of Leavitt's face as she said it began to circulate, spliced next to images of AOC standing on a Bronx street corner with a clipboard from her earliest campaign days. The phrase "Real America" caught fire, not in the way Leavitt had intended. Veterans, immigrants, small-town teachers, single moms, and second-generation kids All started posting their own photos with one line. "This is what real America looks like." By the end of 5 minutes, the clip had been viewed 200,000 times. By 10, it hit 1 million. Inside the hearing room, Caroline Leavitt still stood by the side hallway, unaware. She thought the room had gone quiet because she had paused it. But in truth, the silence was filling with something else. Something louder than speeches, louder than slogans. It was the sound of a country beginning to understand what had just been said when someone believed no one was listening. And all the while, back at the media board, the red light on Channel 7 still burned steady. The mic had never gone dead. It had just waited long enough for the truth to step forward on its own. It spread the way truth often does in the modern age, not through speeches or press conferences, but through the quiet urgency of a share button. The clip of Caroline Leavitt's comment, caught on a still hot mic, had no edits, no commentary, no dramatic music, just words bare and weighted. And those words landed like a stone dropped into the center of a lake. Concentric circles of disbelief, anger, and reflection rippling outward with every passing minute. Within an hour, 2 hashtags began to dominate. Hashtag Mick was never off and hashtag Real America Speaks. The first, a factual reminder. The second, a rebuttal that began to take on a life of its own. At a small diner in Tucson, an older Latino veteran scrolled through his phone in silence. His breakfast sat untouched as he replayed the clip twice, then a third time. He had served in 2 tours overseas, paid his mortgage off year by year, raised 4 children. And now a sitting congresswoman had decided that people like him didn't understand real America. He didn't tweet. He didn't need to. But that clip stayed open on his screen for the rest of the morning. In the Bronx, a community organizer posted a photo of herself holding her grandmother's naturalization certificate with the caption, "She cleaned office buildings for 30 years and never missed an election." Don't tell me we don't belong. It got 22,000 retweets in under 5 hours. By early afternoon, social media was full of images, faces, families, hands folded in prayer, children holding small American flags. The phrase "Real America" had been claimed and redefined in real time by the very people Leavitt had dismissed with a single sentence. Of course, not everyone was outraged. Some of Leavitt's supporters doubled down. Conservative commentators framed the leak as a targeted smear, claiming that context was missing, even though the full clip was still available, uninterrupted. Talk radio hosts blamed leftist operatives and woke surveillance. One anchor suggested the comment was merely philosophical, but something about the moment resisted spin. It wasn't just the words. It was the ease, the tone, the way she had leaned in to say it, unguarded, like a thought that had been resting comfortably behind her smile for years. And it wasn't just the reaction. It was the silence that followed. Because even as the clip made its way across phones, airwaves, and inboxes, AOC said nothing. No tweet, no video, no press statement. She didn't repost the clip. She didn't call for resignation. She didn't show up on MSNBC that night. And the country noticed. People waited for her response the way you wait for thunder after seeing lightning. But it didn't come. Not immediately. And that absence, far from being weak, grew stronger with every hour. Commentators began to point it out. Has AOC responded yet? Became its own kind of question online. Some said she was being strategic. Others said she was stunned. But a growing number began to sense something else entirely. That silence was no accident. It was a signal. A steady refusal to let the moment get swallowed by shouting. A statement that didn't need amplification. In a time when politics moved fast and loud, her stillness felt almost radical. That night, a short clip went viral. Just a still image of Alexandria sitting in the hearing room earlier that day watching. No text, no sound. Just her face calm and unreadable. The caption read, "She heard it, and she's letting all of us hear it too." By the end of the night, hashtag Mick was never off had passed 3 million uses. And AOC still hadn't spoken, but somehow she had already said more than anyone else. By the time the sun rose over Washington the next morning, Caroline Leavitt was already seated in a TV studio chair, the blue and white glow of a morning show set wrapped around her like a second skin. The clip had broken containment. It wasn't just trending, it was dominating. Major outlets were looping it, opinion pages were framing it, and social media had begun to turn the quote into a cultural dividing line. Leavitt knew she couldn't stay silent, so she did what Washington figures always do when the walls start to close in. She booked airtime. Lots of it. She began with a smile, perfectly practiced, framed by a soft-focus camera angle and a sympathetic host. "Look," she said, with just enough exasperation to imply victimhood, "anyone who's ever worked in politics knows private conversations get taken out of context all the time. What I said wasn't an attack. It was a reflection on how complicated our national identity has become." The host nodded politely, prompting her gently. "So you're saying your words were misunderstood?" "Completely," Leavitt replied. "I wasn't speaking about any one person. I was speaking about a larger cultural shift, about how guilt and grievance have taken over our national dialogue. It was the beginning of a well-rehearsed pivot. By the second interview, she was describing the backlash as a form of selective outrage. By the third, she had begun blaming cancel culture, accusing unnamed leftist operatives of trying to derail her work on border security by weaponizing a stray phrase. "These kinds of hit job," she said on a conservative radio show later that morning, "are exactly why good people don't run for office. Because if you step out of line for even a second, they'll twist your words, call you a bigot, and try to destroy your life." On her social media feeds, the narrative was even sharper. She posted an image of herself from the hearing, hand raised mid-sentence, captioned with, "I won't apologize for defending real Americans." Her base responded in kind. Comments flooded in. "Stay strong. They're afraid of your voice. You're saying what we're all thinking." Donations ticked up. A PAC aligned with her launched a counter-campaign called #NoMoreSilence, attempting to reframe her as a martyr of political correctness. But outside that echo chamber, the tone was different. In suburban neighborhoods across Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Arizona, voters who didn't usually tune into hearings were now watching the clip. They weren't pundits. They weren't Twitter addicts. They were teachers, nurses, veterans, people who still believed words mattered. And what they heard didn't sound like a mistake. It sounded like something she meant. An independent voter from Lancaster posted on Facebook, "I don't even like AOC, but that comment, it crossed a line." A retired school principal in Milwaukee wrote, "She didn't deny it. She just blamed everyone else." The ground didn't quake, but it shifted. Leavitt's base applauded louder, but the country's middle, the undecided, the moderate, the unsure, began to pull back, not because of a scandal, but because of something more subtle and more dangerous to any politician. Doubt. Doubt about what she actually believed. Doubt about who she thought she represented. And as Leavitt moved from screen to screen, microphone to microphone, her words didn't erase the moment. They repeated it. They stamped it deeper. Meanwhile, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez remained silent. No rebuttal, no tweet, no statement. But her silence had begun to take on weight. Not emptiness, but mass. The kind of silence people listen to. And in that quiet, the country started asking a different question. If this was how Leavitt acted when she thought no one was listening, what else had she said behind closed doors? The door to Alexandria's office clicked shut with a quiet finality. Outside, reporters milled in the hallway, waiting for a quote that wouldn't come. Inside, the world was still. No cameras, no podium, just four people around a table with laptops, notepads, and tired eyes that had seen the clip go viral a dozen times in less than 12 hours. AOC stood near the window, arms crossed loosely, staring out at a sky that couldn't decide whether it wanted to rain. The city was noisy with opinion, but her office held a calm that felt heavier than silence. She hadn't spoken since the hearing. Her team hadn't pushed. They knew her rhythm, knew she didn't rush outrage just to match the moment. She waited until she understood what needed to be said, not just what people expected her to say. "They expect rage," she said finally, her voice level, her eyes still on the skyline. "That's the trap. That's the setup. They want a headline that proves their narrative." She turned back toward her staff, her voice firm now. "I'll give them something else. I'll give them truth." The room straightened, not physically, but emotionally. The weight of her tone settled everyone into purpose. Jen, her communications lead, spoke first. "We could do a video. Keep it raw. Just you and a handheld mic, straight to camera. No graphics, no cuts. No, Alexandria said gently. Not this time. Not fast. Not reactive. We're not chasing them. She sat down, pulled a notepad toward her. This isn't about winning the news cycle. It's about naming something deeper. The message isn't for the ones already yelling. It's for the ones who are listening. Her legislative director nodded. Then we write. Not a post, not a clip. A speech. AOC didn't respond immediately. She opened the drawer to her left, the one she kept mostly untouched except on days that required remembering. Inside was a folded piece of lined paper, soft from age and handling. Her father's handwriting, small and steady, ran across it in blue ink. Don't yell. Make them lean in to listen. She had found the note during college, years after his passing. It wasn't written for politics. It was written for life. But in this moment, it felt like instruction. She placed the paper beside her notepad and let out a slow breath. We write, she said again, this time with certainty. But we don't write for applause. We write for impact. For that teenage girl in Kansas who just heard the words "Real America" and wondered if she's part of it. For the Vietnam vet who didn't say anything online but hasn't stopped thinking about that clip since yesterday morning. Jen was already typing. We'll need 3 parts. Narrative, response, resolution. No. AOC shook her head. We don't need to respond to her. She's not the center of this. The country is. The idea of who belongs here, that's the center. Her legislative director added, so this is about reframing the moment? Alexandria looked up, her eyes sharper now. This is about reclaiming it. Outside, the chatter continued. Pundits speculated. Anchors argued. Twitter trended and recycled outrage into content. But in that quiet room, a different kind of energy took root. Not reaction, but reflection. And beneath it, the slow build of something more enduring. Intention. Alexandria touched her father's note once more before she picked up her pen. Not to mimic his words, but to honor them. She wasn't going to yell. She was going to make them lean in. And this time, really listen. In a narrow apartment on the 3rd floor of a red brick walk-up in the South Bronx, a small television flickered in the corner of the kitchen. The morning news was looping the clip again, Leavitt's words playing on repeat, crisp and clear despite their ugliness. The sound of the kettle on the stove hissed softly in the background, but not loud enough to drown out the sentence. She only got here because of the guilt this country still carries. She'll never understand real America. Carmen Rivera, 72, didn't flinch. She'd already heard it 4 times today and 3 the night before, but each time it hit a little differently. Not like a slap, but like the dull ache of something old being reopened. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and leaned against the counter. Her grandson Mateo sat at the small table with a bowl of cereal, half-eaten, spoon resting limp in his hand. He looked up at her, his dark eyes full of something she recognized. That particular kind of confusion kids feel when something unfair becomes visible for the first time. Abuela, he asked softly, why does she sound like she hates people like us? Carmen didn't answer right away. She moved toward the television, turned the volume down, and sat beside him. She doesn't know us, she said slowly. She doesn't know your mama who works double shifts. She doesn't know your Tio who drives a bus through snow and heat. She only knows the story she tells herself, and maybe she's never heard another one. Mateo nodded, but the line still hung in the air between them, like the smell of burned toast. Hundreds of miles south in a quiet suburb outside Mobile, Alabama, Robert Gaines sat in his recliner, his left leg stretched stiff from the shrapnel he still carried from 1969. He had seen the clip first on Facebook, sent by an old Marine buddy with no caption, just the video. He'd watched it once, then again. He didn't tweet, didn't repost. But after the 3rd viewing, he let out a long, low breath and said to the empty room, that wasn't just a mistake. That's how she really talks. Robert had grown up in a world where some people said those kinds of things all the time. In public, in office, in church. He thought they'd faded, or at least gotten quieter. But the voice in the clip didn't sound new. It sounded comfortable, like it belonged to someone who had said it before. Maybe in smaller rooms, to smaller groups without cameras. Later that afternoon, he called his granddaughter, a senior at the University of Alabama. She was studying political science and organizing voter registration drives. He told her to send him the link to that congresswoman from New York. The one they call AOC, he said. I want to hear what she says when she finally talks. And in living rooms, kitchens, classrooms, and barbershops, people just like Carmen and Robert were having the same reaction. Not explosive, not dramatic, just clear. The kind of clarity that doesn't need headlines to feel real. The reaction to Leavitt's comment wasn't just about what she said, it was about what she revealed. And in that reveal, something quiet but powerful began to move. A re-examination of who America listens to and who America still tries to ignore. Alexandria still hadn't spoken, but the silence had already found its echo in the homes of people who knew what it was like to be doubted, dismissed, or diminished. And in that silence, something unexpected had begun to grow. Recognition. 2 days after the clip aired, as the headlines began to settle into a rhythm and the media spin churned along its predictable cycle, an email slipped quietly into a reporter's inbox. No subject line, no name, just a Gmail address that gave away nothing except its own caution. Truthfeed 2024 at protonmail.com. The reporter, Samira Khan, had been covering Capitol Hill for almost a decade. She'd seen tips, fakes, leaks, and noise. But something about the timing and the bluntness made her pause. The message read simply, "This wasn't the first time. There's a group chat, screenshots, audio. I need you to see it." There was no link, no attachment, just an invitation for conversation. Samira didn't hesitate. She replied with a secure drop link and a short note. "I'm listening." By sunset, the first file arrived, a screenshot from a private messaging group with a title that made her stomach tighten. The Real Ones. The usernames were vague, but some profile images matched staffers she'd seen milling around Capitol offices, communications aides, junior researchers, one legislative director. In the thread, Leavitt's name came up more than once. So did AOC's. The messages were coarse, sometimes cruel. One mocked Alexandria's voice during a floor speech. Still sounds like a waitress trying to explain inflation. Another joked about border brats being trained to vote blue by 2030. A third included a distorted meme of AOC's face superimposed onto a cartoon of a child crossing the desert. But it wasn't just the mockery, it was the comfort, the way it all unfolded in casual shorthand. Like this was routine, shared among friends who believed they were safe behind screens. Then came the audio, a voice, unmistakably Leavitt's, laughing in a hallway. The context wasn't fully clear, but the sentence was. "They say we need to be more inclusive. I say, let them learn English first." The tone was flippant, dismissive, the kind of line that wouldn't raise eyebrows in certain private rooms, but now in the wake of a public mic gaffe, felt radioactive. Samira listened twice, then a third time. She closed her laptop slowly, exhaling into the silence. She wasn't shocked, not entirely, but there was a difference between suspecting something and seeing it confirmed in real time, with receipts. She picked up her phone and called her editor. "This is more than just a hot mic," she said. "It's a pattern. This woman didn't just slip. She swims in this stuff. And now we've got proof." The story began to take shape, not as an opinion piece, not as a takedown, but as a carefully documented exposé built around digital evidence, testimony, and a timeline of conduct. They would need verification, corroboration, legal eyes on every line. But the frame was clear. Leavitt's words weren't a one-time mistake. They were part of a culture. As Samira began compiling quotes, a second message landed from the same anonymous account. "I was part of it," it began. "I didn't speak up because I thought it was just dark humor. But after that clip, I couldn't unhear it. I couldn't keep pretending." AOC hadn't responded to Leavitt, not publicly, not even indirectly, but her silence, intentional and steady, had created a space big enough for the truth to walk in on its own. People weren't just waiting for her speech anymore. They were starting to speak for her, to fill in the silence with their own reckoning, to to confess what had been ignored. Sometimes leadership doesn't arrive with a bullhorn. Sometimes it's in the way a woman refuses to answer a lie until the world is ready to face the truth without her having to shout it. And suddenly, the story wasn't just about what Leavitt said. It was about what she'd been allowed to keep saying for far too long. By the third day, Samira Khan's article had shifted from breaking story to slow-burning scandal. Major outlets picked it up cautiously, quoting her original report while waiting for corroboration. But in the inboxes of journalists and watchdogs, more files began to surface, sent by staffers, interns, and anonymous sources no longer willing to carry the weight of silence. What emerged wasn't just one group chat or one careless comment. It was a hidden current of digital coordination, revealing a broader strategy that had been operating quietly just beneath the surface of Washington politics. The center of it all was a private Slack workspace titled Project Shield. It wasn't officially affiliated with any congressional office. On paper, it didn't exist. But several usernames in the chat matched known communication staffers, super PACs employees, and media consultants aligned with far-right messaging groups. What the logs showed wasn't criminal, but it was telling. The messages, time-stamped and archived, outlined weekly talking points, meme drafts, and viral bait strategies. And woven throughout, there was one persistent theme: AOC as a threat that had to be culturally undermined, not just politically opposed. In one exchange, a consultant suggested emphasizing her performance-style tone and aggressive cadence as part of a campaign to subtly frame her as un-American in temperament. Another message bluntly said, "The Bronx thing plays well for some, but we can flip that, play up the accent, splice it into emotional rants, make her sound unstable." But the most disturbing document wasn't a message. It was a strategy memo labeled Narrative Positioning, Q3 Target Demographics, Metro to Midwest. The memo, dated 2 months before the hearing, included several recommended lines of attack, most of them vague, poll-tested phrases about urban elitism and coastal radicals. But buried deep in the second page, under the subheading Cultural Contrast Messaging, was a line that turned Samira's stomach. Use audio cuts of Representative Ocasio-Cortez's accent in longer speeches. Frame as unrelatable, possibly manufactured. Goal: undermine perceived Americanness without explicit reference to race. There it was, a blueprint, not just to oppose, but to de-Americanize, not just to challenge ideas, but to discredit identity. The racism was coded, not shouted, but it was there, precise, polished, and repackaged as strategy. Samira triple-checked the source trail. The file had been forwarded through multiple channels, but the metadata matched. It had originated from a firm with ties to several Republican messaging campaigns. One name stood out: a strategist who'd appeared on cable news defending Leavitt just a day earlier, calling the hot mic incident overblown drama. The contradiction was chilling. In public, deflection, indignation, media fatigue. In private, carefully constructed messaging based on sowing doubt about a congresswoman's voice, because it didn't sound white enough, safe enough, soft enough. When the full report was finally published, titled "The Secret Channel: How Language Became a Weapon," the response was immediate and visceral. Activist groups began circulating the memo. Linguists and scholars weighed in on the deep history of accent-based discrimination. Educators shared their own stories of being told to speak properly. And Latinas across the country posted videos of themselves reading Leavitt's quote aloud, followed by their own names, hometowns, and proud declarations. "This is what American sounds like." Inside her office, AOC read the article once, then again. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just circled one line in the memo with a pen: "Make her sound less American," and she underlined it twice. The irony wasn't lost on her, because her accent wasn't a performance, it was an inheritance. A chorus of Bronx bodegas, subway platforms, church halls, and kitchen table debates. They hadn't just targeted her voice, they had targeted everyone who ever grew up being told theirs didn't belong. And now the country was beginning to realize it wasn't just a slip of the tongue, it was a plan. By the time the memo was made public, Something in the national mood had shifted. The question was no longer whether Caroline Leavitt had said something offensive. It had become much bigger. How long had she believed it? And who had helped her spread it? The evidence was too precise. The group chats, the audio clips, the strategy document outlining plans to weaponize Aoc'S voice. It wasn't an accident. It was a pattern. Calculated, repeated, and normalized within a network of operatives who were counting on people not paying attention. But now people were. Mainstream outlets that had previously tread lightly began using stronger language. The New York Times ran a headline that read, "From Rhetoric to Strategy, How a Culture of Derision Was Baked In." USA Today published testimonials from staffers of color who had long suspected they were being mocked behind closed doors. CNN aired a special segment titled, "Not Just a Gaffe, The Infrastructure Behind Political Othering." And then came the calls for action. Several members of Congress, Democrats and a small number of moderate Republicans, publicly demanded a formal investigation. Representative Linda Garcia introduced a resolution calling for a vote on censure, citing a pattern of behavior unbecoming of a member of this institution. The Congressional Hispanic Caucus released a unified statement. This is not about politics, it's about character. Meanwhile, Caroline Leavitt went on the defensive. Again, at a press conference outside her district office, she refused to back down. "This is an orchestrated smear by the far left," she said, flanked by two loyal colleagues. "I will not apologize for having private conversations or being honest about what millions of Americans already believe. Cancel culture will not silence me." The crowd behind her was smaller than usual. Supporters still showed up online, echoing her talking points, accusing the media of manufacturing outrage. But something had cracked. Conservative independents who once admired her outspokenness began to second-guess it. Veterans who had stayed quiet the first time now questioned what else had been said behind closed doors. Parents of bilingual children wondered what message this all sent about their voices too. It was no longer about party. It was about what people were willing to tolerate and what they weren't. On the House floor, discussions intensified. Several lawmakers from immigrant backgrounds spoke personally and directly. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't demand revenge. They simply asked a question: what happens to this institution if we allow language like this to pass without consequence? And still, Aoc's said nothing. No press statement, no camera appearance, no tweets. She showed up to votes, took meetings, walked through the halls of Congress with the same quiet composure she'd held since the beginning. But even in her silence, she was present, deeply present. Every reporter noted it. Every camera lens caught it. Her restraint wasn't being read as fear anymore. It was being recognized as something else: strength. Because while Leavitt scrambled for cover and her allies fell back into talking points, Alexandria never had to raise her voice. The truth had already done it for her. The facts were louder than outrage. The receipts, those screenshots, that audio, the memo, were clearer than any speech. And so, as the country watched the backlash unfold, one truth rose above the noise. This wasn't about a single slip. It was about a system that had quietly made room for contempt and assumed no one would notice. But people had noticed, and the woman at the center of the storm hadn't flinched. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't begged. She had simply waited. And now the weight of that patience was beginning to fall, not on her shoulders but on theirs. The House chamber was unusually quiet that morning, the kind of quiet that wasn't born from decorum but from tension, uncertain, unspoken, and stretched thin over every seat like a taut wire. No official statement had been scheduled. No public notice had been given, and yet somehow the room had filled to capacity. Members sat with their devices off. Aides stood along the walls. Even the most inattentive lawmakers leaned forward just enough to suggest they sensed something was coming. And then Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez rose. She didn't rush. She didn't straighten her jacket or glance at her notes. She simply stood, eyes clear, spine steady, and walked slowly down the aisle. The room tracked her movement like a metronome. Even the speaker seated at the dais said nothing, just watched her approach with an unreadable expression. She reached the podium and paused. No fanfare, no gavel, no clapping. Just a moment, full and expectant. Across the country, newsrooms scrambled. Every major network cut to the House floor. Banners flashed, representative, AOC to speak, unannounced. Twitter lit up instantly. Millions tuned in, wondering what she would say, how she would say it, whether she would respond with fire or facts, confrontation or calm. She took a breath, then began. There are words we whisper when we think no one listens, she said, her voice low, steady. Sometimes we say them out of fear, sometimes out of frustration, and sometimes we say them because we believe the room is full of people who already agree. No one moved, she continued. But every now and then, those words leave the room. They find their way into daylight. Not because someone shouted, but because a mic was on. Because a recording didn't stop. And in that moment, what was whispered becomes public, and what was private becomes permanent. She didn't name Leavitt. She didn't have to. The echo of that clip, the now infamous line about guilt, belonging, and real America, hung invisibly in the space behind every chair. Alexandria leaned slightly forward, her hands still at her sides. I've been told that I don't represent the real America, that I am somehow less, somehow foreign, because my roots don't stretch back to Mayflower stories, or because my accent doesn't smooth itself into Ivy League vowels. Her tone never rose. She didn't speed up. She spoke as if to one person, not hundreds. But I've watched my mother work 12-hour shifts scrubbing floors in homes she couldn't afford. I've seen my neighbors raise kids and hope with the same quiet pride that built this country. I've stood in bodegas, classrooms, hospitals, and church basements, all filled with people who never made the evening news, but who carry this democracy on their backs. There was a pause, a stillness, not for effect, but for gravity. So I ask, she said quietly, when someone says real America, who are they talking about? And who are they leaving out? No one answered. She looked down for a moment, then back up. This speech wasn't planned. No consultants, no hashtags, just something I needed to say. Because I believe silence, while powerful, must eventually give way to clarity. And then she closed with a line no one would forget. The mic was never off, and America was always listening. There was no eruption, not right away. Just a deep, long breath that seemed to move across the room like a wave. Then a few chairs creaked as members rose, some slowly, others with conviction. A murmur of clapping grew, restrained at first, then fuller. Not all applauded. A few crossed their arms. A few looked down. But the moment didn't belong to them. It belonged to the silence that came before, and to the words that had broken it. Not with rage, not with revenge, but with something harder. Restraint. Outside, reporters fumbled for adjectives. Inside, her staff sat wordless. The speech wasn't long. It wasn't flashy. But it had done something no interview could. It reminded the nation that character isn't built in the spotlight. It's revealed in the quiet. When you choose not just to speak, but to mean every word. There were a dozen ways Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez could have taken the microphone that day. Dozens of angles, all valid. She could have condemned. She could have listed every insult, every memo, every thread from the group chats and dragged them, one by one, into the light. She could have used names. She could have used heat. But she didn't. She chose something harder. I want to tell you a story, she said, hands resting gently on the sides of the podium, eyes steady but not sharp. It won't make headlines. It probably won't even trend. But it's the only way I know how to respond. There was a stillness in the room, not the silence of anticipation, but something softer. Listening. Real listening. My father, she began, died when I was 18. He worked 2 jobs, construction and running a small business from home. I watched him come home some nights with dust still on his clothes, hands cracked, back aching, and he'd still sit down to help me with my homework. Her voice didn't shake. It didn't need to. It moved with a quiet clarity, like someone walking a well-worn path they knew by heart. My mother cleaned houses for decades. She used to leave at 5:30 in the morning, catch a bus, work in neighborhoods that didn't always look at her like she belonged. She carried bleach and pride in the same bag. She paused, not to gather herself, but to let the room catch up. I wasn't born in a marble hall, she said. I didn't grow up reciting quotes from presidents over dinner. I didn't learn politics through internships or prep school debates. I learned it watching my mother balance checkbooks late at night. I learned it translating bills into English at 10 years old. I learned it in the waiting rooms, the subway platforms, the public schools where the ceilings leaked and the textbooks were older than we were. There was no applause, no interruption, just stillness. I didn't grow up with the assumption that I belonged here, she continued, her gaze moving slowly across the chamber. But I stand here today, not as an exception, and certainly not as a mistake. I stand here because people like my parents believed in the promise of this country, even when it didn't believe back. The words settled. No name had been said, no opponent called out, but everyone knew. I hear a lot about what's real in this country, about who counts, about who speaks like an American, or who looks like one, or who understands the so-called heartland. She let the thought rest a moment before adding, but I've read this Constitution, not as decoration, but as instruction. I don't carry it in a pocket. I carry it in my bones. It was quiet enough to hear a pin drop. A few rows back, a Republican congressman who rarely looked up from his phone during floor speeches now sat frozen, his hands clasped tightly. Across the aisle, a newly elected representative from Illinois blinked twice, visibly swallowing. Alexandria looked down at her notes, not to read them, but as if in prayer, and then raised her eyes again. I came to Congress not to play pretend or posture for cameras. I came because my community sent me here to fight for them, not out of guilt, not out of grievance, but out of love. For them, for this place, for what it can be. There were no grand gestures, no slogans, just presence, just story. She hadn't clapped back. She hadn't roasted anyone. She had done something far rarer. She had made space for truth, for history, for herself. And in that moment, even those who disagreed with her felt something shift. Because it's hard to argue with someone who speaks not to win, but to be understood. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez didn't win the room with power. She held it with grace and left it fuller than she found it. Alexandria let the quiet settle before she spoke again. Her last sentence still hovered above the chamber like a thread of smoke. Personal, unflinching, grounded in truth. She could have ended it there. Let her story do the talking. But some moments, she knew, weren't meant to just pass through. Some had to be marked, deliberately, permanently, with language that wouldn't evaporate when the cameras shut off or when the news cycle shifted to something shinier. She glanced down once more, touched the corner of the old paper tucked inside her folder, her father's handwriting, still faint but legible. Don't yell. Make them lean in to listen. He had been right. But now, just for one moment, it was time to raise her voice. Not in anger, not in retaliation, but in declaration. She looked up. Her eyes swept the chamber slowly. Not just the seats, but the people. She met their stares, even the ones that tried not to meet hers. She didn't rush. She let them feel the pause, the anticipation. And then, with full breath and a voice sharpened by both clarity and restraint, she spoke. The mic was never off, and America was always listening. She didn't shout it. She lifted it. The sentence rang not with volume, but with finality. It didn't beg to be remembered. It commanded memory. In that instant, the room reacted, not with cheers or slogans, but with movement. First one member stood, then another. It wasn't choreographed. There were no cues. People rose because they couldn't stay seated. From the back row to the front bench, lawmakers from both parties stood. Not all, but enough to make it clear. Something had landed that politics couldn't explain. The applause began slowly, measured, reverent even. No one rushed to clap over her words, as often happens in these chambers. They waited, almost as if to protect the sentence for a few more seconds before letting it go. Some GOP members stayed seated, their hands still, their expressions unreadable. But even they didn't speak, not to interrupt, not to dismiss. They sat in the silence left behind and chose not to fill it. And that in itself spoke volumes. In the press gallery above, journalists scribbled furiously. Cameras zoomed in, Screens across the country flashed headlines in real time. But what America saw wasn't just a woman delivering a powerful line. It was a reckoning, measured, intentional, and impossible to spin into something else. Because it hadn't been a performance. It had been a truth spoken aloud in a room that too often confuses volume with value. And AOC had known exactly when to speak and when not to. Down on the floor, a freshman representative from Ohio whispered to his colleague, "She didn't just answer them. She buried the whole thing in one line." His colleague nodded quietly, and she didn't even say her name. When the clapping died down, Alexandria stepped back from the podium, not dramatically, not in triumph, but simply as someone who had said what needed to be said. She gathered her papers slowly, methodically, placed them in her folder, and gave one small nod to the speaker. No grin, no wink, no posture, just clarity. As she returned to her seat, a few Democrats reached out to pat her shoulder. One Republican nodded without words. But the most striking part of her return wasn't the applause or the glances. It was the stillness. No one resumed conversation. No one pivoted immediately to business. The chamber simply held the moment, like the end of a hymn before the first breath of a new silence. Outside, in homes across the country, people sat a little straighter on their couches. In classrooms, teachers paused their lessons to replay that final line. In barber shops, veterans, immigrants, and lifelong citizens alike nodded. Not just because they agreed, but because they recognized something they hadn't felt in a long time. Someone telling the truth without needing to scream. And so, that sentence, "The mic was never off, and America was always listening," didn't just echo through the chamber. It left the building. It threaded itself into conversations, into headlines, into memory. It became not just a line, it became a turning point. The chamber eventually moved on. Resolutions were read, amendments proposed, votes tallied. But something in the air didn't return to normal. It couldn't. Alexandria's speech hadn't just landed, it had shifted something. And while the news cycle tried to keep pace with new developments, the deeper effects started to show themselves not on television screens, but in polls, in fundraisers, in the quiet recalibrations of power that only come when perception finally cracks. Caroline Leavitt returned to her district a few days later. She stepped off the plane in her signature red blazer, flanked by staffers trying to look confident. But gone was the swarm of cameras. Gone were the local TV crews who once greeted her arrivals like she was a conquering figure. What remained were questions, plain and pointed. A local reporter, usually friendly to her campaign, asked on camera, "Congresswoman, do you regret the comment now that the full strategy memo has been made public?" Leavitt smiled thinly and pivoted to talking points. But the damage wasn't in the question. It was in the fact that it had been asked at all. Within a week, her approval rating among independents in her district dropped by 12 points. National polls showed even steeper declines. One headline from Politico read, "Leavitt stumbles as AOC surges in cross-partisan appeal." Donors who had once filled her war chest quietly withdrew. A major finance executive based in Philadelphia, who had bundled over $250,000 in the last cycle, told The Hill, "I can't defend her words and I won't finance them." That kind of shift doesn't show up in viral clips. It shows up in calendar cancellations, voicemail messages gone unreturned, and invitations to fundraisers that no longer include your name. Leavitt's campaign attempted to blame media distortion, but even her team knew the problem wasn't just what she'd said, it was that people now believed she meant it. Then came the ethics complaint. A prominent nonpartisan watchdog group filed a formal request for investigation into coordinated discriminatory messaging conducted through unofficial channels in the service of targeted political harm. The filing didn't allege criminal wrongdoing, but it did raise serious questions about misuse of staff and whether taxpayer resources had been used to craft racially loaded messaging strategies. The House Ethics Committee didn't promise immediate action. It rarely does. But the words "under review" appeared in a public memo, and that alone was enough to make waves. News anchors repeated it with raised brows. Political analysts speculated on implications. The smell of accountability, however faint, was now in the room. But none of it, not the polls, not the donors, not even the ethics filing, carried the weight of the cultural shift happening quietly in the middle of the country. In town halls in Wisconsin, in high school civics classes in Ohio, and on church pews in North Carolina, voters who didn't usually speak of congressional hearings had started using Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's name with a kind of grudging respect. Not because they agreed with her politics, not because they were suddenly turning progressive, but because they had seen something they hadn't expected: composure, clarity, restraint. A young woman from the Bronx had been targeted, first with condescension, then with a campaign to delegitimize her presence, and instead of screaming, she had waited. She had listened. And when the moment was right, she had spoken with dignity and purpose. It wasn't performative. It wasn't political theater. It was human. And it resonated. A polling memo from a centrist research group put it simply: among suburban independents age 50-plus representative, Ocasio-Cortez's credibility has reached its highest level since entering office. Caroline Leavitt had hoped to make Alexandria a symbol of what was wrong with the country. But in trying so hard to expose her, she had revealed more about herself. And in the space left by that revelation, America began to re-examine its assumptions, not just about who belonged in Congress, but about what kind of voice truly represented real America. Not the loudest one, but the one that could wait, the one that could endure, and, when necessary, the one that could finally speak, not to retaliate, but to remind. In a public high school outside Madison, Wisconsin, Ms. Keller printed out the transcript of Aoc'S speech and handed it to her seniors in U.S. government. It wasn't on the syllabus, but after watching the moment unfold, she knew it was worth discussing. Today, she said gently, we're not studying history. We're watching it happen. Her students read silently at first, then aloud in turns. No one interrupted. When they reached the line, the mic was never off, and America was always listening. A few looked up, eyes wide, as if finally understanding what rhetoric sounded like when it was real. In a small town near Roanoke, Virginia, a Vietnam veteran named Harold typed a letter to his local paper. His knuckles still ached from years of carpentry, but the words came easily. I didn't vote for her. I probably never will. But that woman's got spine. And if we want leaders with guts, we ought to recognize it when it shows up. The editor published it the next day, uncut. Farther south in El Paso, Texas, a 17-year-old girl named Mariella sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor, earbuds in, laptop open, and heart pounding. She had never heard someone on a national stage sound like her aunt, her mom, her own voice. And in that echo, she felt something unlock. That night, she created an Instagram account and posted the first episode of her podcast. Mic was never off. In it, she told her story. No script, just truth. She said, I used to think we had to sound a certain way to be heard, but she proved that your voice doesn't have to change for people to lean in. And across the country, conversations began, not in Congress, but in kitchens, classrooms, and corners of America that had been quiet for too long. The envelope was tucked into a stack of mail, wedged between a policy briefing and a flyer for a local event she couldn't attend. No return address, just a child's handwriting on the front. To Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Congress. The lines weren't straight, and the letters leaned gently to the left, like they were hurrying to say something important. Alexandria opened it slowly. Inside was a single sheet of wide-ruled notebook paper, decorated in the corners with tiny hearts and stars drawn in purple ink. The letter was written in pencil. It began simply, Hi, Ms. Aoc. My name is Liana. I'm 10. I saw you on TV. You didn't yell, but everyone still listened. I used to be scared to talk in class because I looked different from the other girls. But after your speech, I raised my hand for the first time and answered a question. My teacher smiled. That never happened before. I want to be like you when I grow up. I want to help people and wear cool glasses and say big things without being afraid. My mom said I should write you. So I am. Thank you. By the time the sun rose over Washington the next morning, Caroline Leavitt was already seated in a TV studio chair, the blue and white glow of a morning show set wrapped around her like a second skin. The clip had broken containment. It wasn't just trending, it was dominating. Major outlets were looping it, Opinion pages were framing it, and social media had begun to turn the quote into a cultural dividing line. Leavitt knew she couldn't stay silent, so she did what Washington figures always do when the walls start to close in. She booked airtime. Lots of it. She began with a smile, perfectly practiced, framed by a soft-focus camera angle and a sympathetic host. "Look," she said, with just enough exasperation to imply victimhood, "anyone who's ever worked in politics knows private conversations get taken out of context all the time. What I said wasn't an attack. It was a reflection on how complicated our national identity has become." The host nodded politely, prompting her gently. "So you're saying your words were misunderstood?" "Completely," Leavitt replied. "I wasn't speaking about any one person. I was speaking about a larger cultural shift, about how guilt and grievance have taken over our national dialogue." It was the beginning of a well-rehearsed pivot. By the second interview, she was describing the backlash as a form of selective outrage. By the third, she had begun blaming cancel culture, accusing unnamed leftist operatives of trying to derail her work on border security by weaponizing a stray phrase. "These kinds of hit job," she said on a conservative radio show later that morning, "are exactly why good people don't run for office. Because if you step out of line for even a second, they'll twist your words, call you a bigot, and try to destroy your life." On her social media feeds, the narrative was even sharper. She posted an image of herself from the hearing, hand raised mid-sentence, captioned with, "I won't apologize for defending real Americans." Her base responded in kind. Comments flooded in. "Stay strong. They're afraid of your voice. You're saying what we're all thinking." Donations ticked up. A PAC aligned with her launched a counter-campaign called #NoMoreSilence, attempting to reframe her as a martyr of political correctness. But outside that echo chamber, the tone was different. In suburban neighborhoods across Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Arizona, voters who didn't usually tune into hearings were now watching the clip. They weren't pundits. They weren't Twitter addicts. They were teachers, nurses, veterans, people who still believed words mattered. And what they heard didn't sound like a mistake. It sounded like something she meant. An independent voter from Lancaster posted on Facebook, "I don't even like AOC, but that comment, it crossed a line." A retired school principal in Milwaukee wrote, "She didn't deny it. She just blamed everyone else." The ground didn't quake, but it shifted. Leavitt's base applauded louder, but the country's middle, the undecided, the moderate, the unsure, began to pull back. Not because of a scandal, but because of something more subtle and more dangerous to any politician. Doubt. Doubt about what she actually believed. Doubt about who she thought she represented. And as Leavitt moved from screen to screen, microphone to microphone, her words didn't erase the moment. They repeated it. They stamped it deeper. Meanwhile, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez remained silent. No rebuttal, no tweet, no statement. But her silence had begun to take on weight. Not emptiness, but mass. The kind of silence people listen to. And in that quiet, the country started asking a different question. If this was how Leavitt acted when she thought no one was listening, what else had she said behind closed doors? The door to Alexandria's office clicked shut with a quiet finality. Outside, reporters milled in the hallway, waiting for a quote that wouldn't come. Inside, the world was still. No cameras, no podium, just four people around a table with laptops, notepads, and tired eyes that had seen the clip go viral a dozen times in less than 12 hours. AOC stood near the window, arms crossed loosely, staring out at a sky that couldn't decide whether it wanted to rain. The city was noisy with opinion, but her office held a calm that felt heavier than silence. She hadn't spoken since the hearing. Her team hadn't pushed. They knew her rhythm, knew she didn't rush outrage just to match the moment. She waited until she understood what needed to be said, not just what people expected her to say. "They expect rage," she said finally, her voice level, her eyes still on the skyline. "That's the trap. That's the setup. They want a headline that proves their narrative." She turned back toward her staff, her voice firm now. "I'll give them something else. I'll give them truth." She walked without urgency, but not without purpose. A few tourists nearby recognized her, one whispering to another with a reverent kind of awe, But no one called out. They watched. She'd become someone the country watched differently now. Near the sidewalk, a young journalist, notebook in hand, stepped forward respectfully. Not pushy, not desperate, just curious. She raised her voice gently. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez. One question, if I may. Alexandria stopped, tilted her head slightly. That moment, the journalist asked, when you didn't speak, then finally did, would you say it defined your legacy? There was a beat of silence, less than a second, but full enough to matter. Then came the smile. Not smug, not dramatic, but the kind that says, I know who I am. I know what I've seen. I know why I stayed silent and why I chose to speak. No, AOC replied, her voice calm and unmistakably sure. But I'm glad America heard me. She turned and walked on, her footsteps fading gently into the everyday hum of the Capitol grounds. Nothing flashy, no applause, just the slow, deliberate movement of someone who had never asked to be the headline, but who had become something far rarer, a mirror, a reckoning, a voice that had waited for its moment and used it not to burn down the room, but to light a candle inside it. And then quietly, the story let go. This story isn't just about politics, it's about dignity, restraint, and the power of presence. AOC didn't fight fire with fire. She chose silence when it stung the most, and words when they mattered the most. In an age of noise, that kind of strength speaks louder than outrage. What lingered wasn't her anger. It was her clarity, her poise, and her unshakable sense of purpose. That moment wasn't about winning a debate. It was about reminding us who deserves the mic and why. Now it's your turn. Have you ever stayed silent when the world expected you to shout? And did it speak louder than words ever could? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Alexandria Rising Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Alexandria Rising Stories.